I never expected my son to do this. But let me start from the beginning, because this story, it's going to sound absolutely unbelievable, but I promise you, every single word is true.
When my son was born, we knew something wasn't right. The doctors told us he had this condition called pectus excavatum. Now, I'd never heard of it before, but basically, his chest was sunken in. Not just a little dent, I'm talking about a serious deformity. The space between his sternum and his spine was only 2.5 inches. 2.5 inches. To put that in perspective, that's about the width of 2 fingers.
His heart and lungs were getting bruised every day just from existing in his own body. I remember the doctor explaining it to us, and I just sat there thinking, how is my kid supposed to live like this? The fear that gripped me in that moment, I can't even describe it. You know that feeling when you realize your child's life is going to be harder than other kids'? That's what hit me like a truck that day. So in December, we scheduled the surgery. They had to crack open his chest and insert 2 nickel bars to basically reshape his rib cage from the inside out. The surgery took hours. I paced that hospital waiting room until I wore a path in the floor. My wife kept telling me to sit down, but I couldn't. How do you sit still when your child is on an operating table having his chest reconstructed? When the surgeon finally came out, he looked exhausted. He told us the procedure went well, but the recovery was going to be brutal, and he wasn't kidding. Watching my son wake up from that surgery, seeing him in that much pain, it changed something in me. I became this overprotective parent overnight. I mean, I was always protective, but this was different. This was fear. The recovery was slow and painful. My son couldn't lift anything heavier than a milk jug. He couldn't play sports, couldn't roughhouse with his brothers, couldn't even carry his own backpack to school. For a kid who just wanted to be normal, it was devastating. I'd catch him staring out the window at other kids playing, and it broke my heart every single time. Then, about 3 weeks after the surgery, something happened that still makes my blood boil when I think about it. My son was hanging out with one of his friends, just goofing around like boys do. His friend threw a playful punch, not meaning any harm at all. But that punch hit right where the bar was, and everything went wrong. I got the call from the school nurse. "Your son is hurt. You need to come now." I broke every speed limit getting to that school. When I saw my son's face, pale and scared, telling me his chest felt wrong, I knew. The bar had dislodged. Another surgery, another trip to that sterile waiting room, another night of watching my child fight through unimaginable pain. The friend who accidentally hurt him was absolutely devastated. Poor kid was crying harder than my son was. He kept apologizing, and I had to reassure him it wasn't his fault, even though inside I was screaming. But you know what the worst part was? My son started to withdraw. He became afraid of physical contact, afraid of getting hurt again. He'd flinch when his brothers came near him. He stopped wanting to hang out with friends. I watched my outgoing, funny kid turn into this scared, isolated version of himself, and it was killing me. Months passed. Physical therapy, doctor visits, careful movements, constant worry. Finally, last week, we got the news we'd been waiting for. The doctor cleared him for most activities. No skateboarding, no bike riding, but he could carry his backpack again. He could hang out with friends without us hovering. He could play pickup games as long as they weren't contact sports. I remember driving home from that appointment, and my son was actually smiling. Not just smiling, he was excited. He kept saying, "I can finally be normal again, Dad. I can finally be normal." I thought our nightmare was over. That evening, he came into my office where I was working. I could tell something was bothering him because he had that look. You know the one. When your kid needs to tell you something important but doesn't know how to start. He sat down across from me and said, "Dad, I need to talk to you about something." And that's when he told me about the bullying. Apparently, there was this kid in his class who had been tormenting him for months. Every single day, this bully would walk into the classroom and punch my son in the head. Not a playful tap, but a real punch. And because my son was terrified of getting hit in the chest again, terrified of damaging those bars, he just took it. Day after day, he endured this abuse in silence. I felt sick. Here I was, thinking I was protecting my son by keeping him safe from physical activity, and meanwhile, some little psychopath was using him as a punching bag every day at school. The guilt hit me like a tidal wave. What kind of father doesn't know his kid is being bullied? My son looked at me with these determined eyes and said, "Dad, I'm cleared now. This kid has been bullying me and hitting me for months. Can I kick his ass?" Now, I need to give you some context about my son. He's not a fighter. Sure, he'll scrap with his brothers at home, but he usually loses those fights too. He's more of a lover than a fighter, if you know what I mean. Sweet kid, kinda sensitive, definitely not the type to throw punches. So when he asked me this, I honestly didn't think he'd go through with it. I thought he was just venting, you know. But I could see how distressed he was. I could see that this had been eating at him for months, and something in me just snapped. I looked my son in the eye and said, "Knock the little bastard out." He just nodded and went to his room. No big reaction, no celebration, just a quiet nod. I thought that was the end of it. Now, I need to tell you about my older son. He's in the same grade as his younger brother because he had a traumatic brain injury a couple years ago and missed a whole year of school. This kid is tough as nails. I mean, surviving a brain injury and coming back stronger, that builds character. And coincidentally, he's in the same class where this bullying was happening. So I went to talk to him. I said, "Your brother told me about this bully. Why haven't you done anything about it?" And his answer surprised me. He said, "Dad, I wanted him to get tough. I figured once he got tired of getting hit, he'd do something about it himself." I could see his logic, but I told him, "Look, handle this situation, but don't get yourself in trouble." He understood. The next morning, I drove both boys to school. It was just a normal Tuesday morning. I dropped them off, came home to get my younger daughter who goes to a different school that starts later. I was actually in a good mood, thinking about how nice it was that my son could finally carry his own backpack again. I'm driving my daughter to her school when my phone rings. It's my wife. She says, "Have you dropped off our daughter yet?" "Well, after you do, you need to go pick up your son. He got in a fight." My heart sank. I immediately assumed it was my older son. I'm thinking, great. He got himself in trouble trying to protect his brother. I dropped off my daughter and drove straight to the school, mentally preparing myself for a conversation with the principal about my older son's protective instincts. I walked into the main office, and what I saw was not what I expected. There was my younger son sitting in a chair with the biggest grin I've ever seen on his face. This kid was absolutely beaming. His whole face was lit up like Christmas morning, and across the room, slumped in another chair with an ice pack pressed against his face, was another kid who looked like he'd been hit by a truck. My son looked at me, pointed at the other kid, and said, "I warned him, Dad. I have never been more proud of anything in my entire life." The principal explained what happened. Apparently, my son walked into class that morning, sat down at his desk like any other day. The bully came over and popped him in the head, just like he'd been doing for months. But this time was different. This time, my older son started to get up to intervene, but before he could even stand up fully, my younger son turned around and decked this kid with one punch. One punch. The bully went down like a sack of potatoes and started crying on the floor. My son told me later that it was the best day of his life. He said seeing that bully crying after months of torment was the most satisfying thing he'd ever experienced. The principal had to suspend him for 3 days because of the school's zero-tolerance policy. But even she seemed to understand the situation. She pulled me aside and said, "Off the record, that bully has been a problem all year. Your son isn't the only kid he's been picking on." As we walked out to the car, my son was practically bouncing. He kept saying, "Did you see his face, Dad? Did you see how scared he looked?" The transformation was incredible. This was the same kid who'd been withdrawn and scared for months, and now he was walking tall, shoulders back, confidence radiating from every step. But the story gets even better. A few days later, the bully's older brother came up to my son at school. I was worried this was going to escalate into some kind of family feud situation. But instead, this kid said, "My brother told me what happened. I actually warned him about you weeks ago. I told him that once you were cleared to fight back, he was going to get his ass kicked. He should have listened." Even the bully's own family knew he had it coming. The 3-day suspension turned into the best 3 days my son had in months. We spent time together, went to movies, played video games. He kept telling everyone who would listen about how he stood up to his bully. His confidence was through the roof. But here's the thing that really amazed me. When he went back to school after the suspension, everything changed. My son has always struggled with social anxiety. Making friends was hard for him. He was the quiet kid who kept to himself. But after word got around about what happened, kids started approaching him. He went from having maybe 1 or 2 friends to being invited to hang out with different groups. The kid who used to hate going to school, who would complain every morning about not feeling well, suddenly couldn't wait to get there. He started talking about his classmates, making plans for after school, joining group projects he never would have participated in before. When summer break started, he was actually disappointed. This is the same kid who used to count down the days until school was out. Now he was asking when he could go back and see his friends. Standing up to that bully didn't just stop the harassment. It completely transformed my son's entire social experience. It gave him confidence he never knew he had. It showed him that he didn't have to be a victim, that he could stand up for himself when necessary. I've thought about this situation a lot over the past few months. Some people might say I was wrong to encourage violence, that I should have gone through proper channels, talked to teachers, involved administrators. And maybe they have a point. But sometimes, as a parent, you have to trust your instincts about what your child needs. My son needed to know that he didn't have to live in fear. He needed to know that he had the power to change his situation. He needed to discover that strength within himself. And sometimes, unfortunately, bullies only understand one language. The medical ordeal with his chest condition taught him that life can be painful and unfair. But standing up to that bully taught him that he doesn't have to accept unfairness lying down. Both lessons were important, but I know which one will serve him better in the long run. Looking back now, I realize that telling my son to knock the little bastard out was one of the most important pieces of advice I've ever given him. Not because violence is the answer to everything, but because sometimes you have to show the world that you won't be pushed around. And you know what the craziest part is? That one moment, that one punch, completely changed the trajectory of my son's entire school experience. From victim to confident kid who can't wait to see his friends. From isolation to popularity. From fear to strength. I never expected my son to actually follow through when I told him to fight back, but I'm so glad he did. Because that day, he didn't just knock out a bully, he knocked out his own fear, his own insecurity, his own belief that he had to accept whatever life threw at him. And that, my friends, was worth every second of that 3-day suspension.